Oxford from the inside. The good, the bad, but always the truth.
Hey guys, I'm Siam. Welcome to Oxford from the Inside, the good, the bad, but always the truth. Here with Anthony. Do you want to introduce yourself, Anthony?
Yeah, hi guys. I'm Anthony, and I'm a second year historian at Trinity College.
So today we're going to be talking about personal statements, and more specifically, like tips on how to write a personal statement for history. So before we get onto that, Anthony, do you have any advice for like what makes a good personal statement in general?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing that's worth mentioning, just kind of worth saying, is that there are obviously many ways of writing a really good personal statement. And I think the stuff that I will say is probably stuff that I kind of picked up while I was applying from my school, but also from kind of my own research that I did. There'll probably be other ways of doing it, and often they're all equally as valid, particularly kind of the structure, as long as the content is good. So I think in terms of structure, what I did and that what I think can work quite well is an introduction where you just set out why you think you'll be a good applicant, followed by kind of 3 paragraphs talking about particular topics that you're interested in to do with your subject, and following that a kind of summary paragraph where you also mention perhaps some of the extracurricular activities that you're doing. In terms of content, as I kind of mentioned, I think the first 3 paragraphs should kind of focus on your subject. So they can include things like stuff that you've done at school, but also things you've done above and beyond the stuff that you've been taught to do at school. And then the last paragraph, I would include kind of things you do outside of school, your hobbies, stuff that make you seem kind of a slightly more well-rounded person. I think that those kind of touches are not essential, particularly I think for Oxford, where the personal statements are meant to be quite academic, but they do help like flesh you out as a person, which is really helpful when you're doing a personal statement.
No, yeah, definitely. Like, I think with the bit about adding the extracurricular paragraph at the end, I remember writing my personal statement. I had quite a lot of academic stuff that I wanted to write, and in the end, I just it was just fully academic in like different ways rather than just the pure like degree stuff, but like other stuff that was outside of the degree but related to the degree. But I think if someone's got too much to write about, then they could probably cut out that extracurricular stuff. If it's for Oxford, do you think it's because like Oxford stuff is they do really like their like stuff that's irrelevant to the degree, that shows that they have that inquisition, that curiosity, etc. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what would you say, like specifically, in your opinion, that you would include in a personal statement for history? Like, how would you go about that?
Yeah, so I'd go back to the kind of 3 main paragraphs or points of your personal statement. And I'd try at the start to identify something that you've done kind of concerning history, that you found particularly interesting, and that kind of stimulated thinking about history in a certain way. So I think the point here definitely isn't to list kind of things that you've done, but demonstrate your historical reasoning, and kind of where an initial interest in a particular topic has taken you. So I think that this can, as I mentioned, include stuff that you've studied as part of your history module at school, but then also books that you've read, potentially projects like the EPQ, extended project qualification, that quite a lot of students have access to, or any other internal school projects that you've done concerning history, and external stuff like potentially essay competitions, if you kind of have the time and resources to apply to those. So picking kind of 3 and exploring the way that you kind of developed as a historian through doing those particular topics. So an example from mine would be a book that I read kind of at the start of my my sixth form, that then inspired like an EPQ, an extended project qualification, so a 5,000-word essay to do with that book and to do with the topic that the book was written about. And then I kind of discussed both the strengths and the weaknesses of my approach. I think that ultimately you want to kind of tell a story to the interviewers who'll be looking at the personal statement. I think it's a story about kind of intellectual exploration, so the way in which your thinking developed as you kind of read more and as you thought more about the subject, as you wrote more about it. And in doing so, you kind of show genuine passion and interest. And I think for Oxford especially, because the personal statement is being read by an interviewer, it's really important that you like those topics and that you kind of well read around them, because otherwise a tutor will probably find out.
So just like hone in on what you're saying. So you say that like that you looked at a part in your A-level course, found it interesting, and then showed in your personal statement how that propelled you on to do your EPQ, and then like continue delving into those ideas. That then obviously shows that you have like an interest and passion into it, but using evidence to show that.
Yeah, that's right.
So so there's a few things I want to I was wondering if you could go into a bit more depth. You said that I was wondering, what do you mean specifically by historical reasoning, and like how, secondly, did this book make you think differently about the subjects that you were studying?
Sure. So I think when I say historical reasoning, I kind of mean more broadly sort of critical reasoning, but applied to history. So, you know, challenging assumptions, kind of thinking about different types of evidence, weighing them up, and most importantly, I think in history, being kind of intellectually flexible and adaptable. And what I mean by that is, you know, as information is coming at you and as you're finding out new ideas, you know, you want to be adapting and developing your argument. You don't want to kind of stick rigidly to a particular point of view and defend it kind of, you know, above all else, when actually what you're realizing is that, you know, the counter arguments are going against you. Sometimes it's important to kind of, in fact, most of the time it's important to adapt what you're thinking in light of new evidence, I think particularly in history, because, you know, history is fundamentally about kind of work, sources, archives, and, you know, when the evidence changes, it's important to also kind of change your opinion. And then you can show that in a personal statement by illustrating how, you know, how your own thinking about a particular topic has changed. In terms of the second part of the question, I think I won't go too into it because it is quite a complex book. But I was studying kind of 20th century Italian history, and I read a book by a historian called Fernand Braudel, which is a very kind of thick book about Italy actually in the 15th, 16th century. But it takes a much more kind of bottom-up history approach to the study of Italy. By bottom-up, I mean studies of kind of life, should we say, as it really was, so beyond politics, towards kind of, you know, social relations between, you know, peasants and villagers, and that, you know, that and the way that kind of Braudel does that invites different questions and different topics to explore, which then kind of, even though it wasn't directly applicable to my course, it did make me think differently about kind of the relationship between what's going on in Rome, in the capital city, and the politics there. You know, the relationship between that and, you know, the real life going on in villages hundreds of miles away. And so, yeah, that's kind of briefly what was so interesting about reading that book.
I was just wondering, so what you were saying before about the personal state, oh, my mind's gone blank. What were you saying before again? Before that,
So I think we were talking about historical reasoning, and you asked me kind of to clarify what that meant.
Oh yeah, I remember now. God. So about how you should be able to be adaptable and change your views. I guess that if you're able to do that, that also shows how you're really teachable. Like the admissions tutors can see that, oh, this person's willing to change their views.
Yeah,
that means
exactly.
I can teach them. They're going to want to learn, and they're not just going to constantly not arrogant, but stubbornly stick to their views. Because I think
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
the interviewers want to see, like when they're looking at their personal statement, that I can teach this person, and they want like they're adaptable. And then because obviously, in the end of the day, the interviews and admissions tutors are going to be the experts, and
Well, exactly. Yeah.
and you're there to learn from them. So yeah, I think like it sounds like there's lots of benefits of being able to put different perspectives and be malleable in your personal statement for sure.
Yeah.
So I remember I read your personal statement before this, and you said something quite interesting about an essay competition and how you actually would have preferred to have changed what you wrote about that in your personal statement. Do you want to elaborate what happened there?
Yeah. So that was just actually kind of putting what I just said previously into practice about kind of intellectual flexibility. So this essay that I wrote for the essay competition, kind of having submitted it, I realized that I actually disagreed with a lot of the arguments that I'd made. And when I was writing my personal statement, I sort of dressed it up and tried to kind of make it seem as convincing as possible, even though I had these doubts. But actually at interview, I think that the interviewers, which are kind of my history tutors, they saw through it, and they basically made me kind of bring down my own argument, which was a really useful intellectual exercise. But, I think I probably could have done that in the personal statement and recognized the weaknesses of my approach in that personal statement, which would have probably elevated it just that little bit more. Because I think if you can recognize and acknowledge that you would have done it differently, it shows a lot of maturity and an ability to think critically. And once you've shown that in your personal statement, then your interview can go kind of the next stage, and you can discuss, those differences with the tutors, which is also a really interesting thing to do in and of itself.
So is it a bold statement to make from me if I was to say you should play devil's advocate when writing a history personal statement, or is that too big of a claim?
I think when it comes to writing a personal statement, it is too big of a claim, but not when it comes to thinking about history in general, because it's always good, obviously, to kind of keep thinking and rethinking the arguments and points you're making. But it's important not to try and force those critiques where they don't seem kind of natural. I think the key word is kind of intellectual honesty, or keywords. If you're looking back on a project and you're thinking, wow, I would have done this differently, then that's great. And that's definitely something that's worth mentioning in a personal statement. But if you're quite content with the work and actually think, you wouldn't have changed much, then, that's actually fine too. And obviously this is just one of my, that essay competition was just one of my kind of 3 paragraphs. And the other 2, I didn't even think to mention a kind of a critique or something I'd do differently, about that particular topic. It's better to kind of explain why it is you were quite convinced by what you did, than try and argue yourself in an artificial way, using kind of counter arguments that maybe don't make that much sense and aren't that solid.
No, yeah, this is so interesting because obviously I do chemistry, and I've done lots of I had lots of help in my personal statement, and I mean, looking at chemistry at different perspectives is something that I was never encouraged to do. Like I was in a chemistry A level, and beginner uni chemistry is quite fundamentally true. So I think that is like really showing how personal statements can be entirely different between disciplines and subjects, which is it's not just proving why you're inquisitive about your subject, even though that's the fundamental aim, but there's subtly different ways of doing that that are more related to the skills of each degree.
Yeah, definitely.
However, just what I also want to see, so I remember, I think you might have said the term, we might have not discussed it yet, but can you explain to us what supercurricular activities are, as they tend to be quite encouraged to be written about in personal statements?
Yeah, definitely. So my understanding of supercurricular activity as opposed to an extracurricular activity is that a supercurricular activity is a kind of fancy word for work or reading that you've done beyond your subject. That wasn't like directly to do with the modules that you were studying. So I think in history, that could be books that you've read, school projects that you've done, like I mentioned, kind of EPQ or others, even podcasts that you've listened to do with history that made you think. Or potentially, a really other useful resource if you've got the time is essay competitions. So I submitted for quite a few, and they're actually very valuable even if you don't win a prize, because you're still delving into a subject quite deeply. And one bit of advice that I definitely say is worth mentioning here, and this is something that I've only discovered very recently, is always ask for feedback whenever you kind of submit a piece of work like that, because even if the headline says we won't send you feedback, a lot of the time when people do get emails, when academics and tutors do get emails from sixth form students asking for feedback, they appreciate that kind of initiative, and they appreciate them actively reaching out and will sometimes offer what they can, which is really, really helpful. So definitely, I think that's just a kind of side tip. Yeah, so those are the main ones. I'd say that essay competitions are, they're a harder one to do, particularly if you don't have access to reading, because you might be able to find some stuff to do with the essay competition in your local libraries, but sometimes it's quite difficult. I certainly found it quite difficult. Something that it might be worth doing is asking someone who's already at university, if you know anyone like that, because they will often have access to student kind of journal databases and be able to kind of help you out with articles. And if you don't, then I'm sure that you can reach out to someone, potentially even part of the kind of access teams or admissions teams at other universities, to see if they can help out as well.
Just before we continue on, going a bit of a tangent, if anyone's listening and they want some access to some free student undergraduate humanities work, Anthony here and a few friends last year created Oxford's first undergraduate humanities journal called BroadStreetHumanities.com, and check that out if you want to look at some student papers on different types of history and I think it's like English literature, philosophy, politics, like all types of humanities. And like I'd imagine you agree, Anthony, that stuff's really good for personal statements, and it's free, and it's a click away.
Yeah, and you'll also be able to find 2 articles written by your very own Siam Raman. So even more exciting. No, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the free advertising. But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that is they are free. They are just on the website, and they are accessible to everyone. So it's definitely worth bringing that up.
So I remember I read a few of my friends' history essays, and for me it seemed like there'll be like one argument at the beginning and a massive amount of evidence to back that up, whereas a lot of people might have just accepted the argument and been happy to move on. So how do you convince an academic tutor that you enjoy backing up your arguments with lots of evidence? Can you do that in a personal statement?
I think you can do that in very kind of brief form. It does take a lot of skill and kind of and keeping kind of making very kind of specific choices with the quite limited word count that you get for the personal statement. But I think it is I think it helps to hone in on 3 particular topics that interested you, rather than listing everything you've done throughout your degree. Once you've narrowed it down to 3, then you've got a paragraph's worth on each one, and you can kind of explore what's going on in there. And I think that tutors will also understand the limitations of the personal statement. And I think if you've given it a good go, and you've chosen topics that you're passionate about, and you've shown how those topics maybe made you think a little bit differently, then that will at least heavily imply, if not show, a kind of quite a close, quite clear kind of critical thinking about the evidence and the underlying evidence, in that particular topic. So I think that academic tutors, they do love their subject and they are really interested in it, and they will be able to tell, if you've kind of explored that topic passionately, whether you're a right fit for them and whether they want to teach you.
No, it is really interesting. So last couple of questions. So say there's this student trying to decide which degree they want to do, and they're very talented in history. What are like the differences between, I don't know, history and politics or history and philosophy? Like how do you know? Because like you might really like the philosophical side of history. Like, is there any advice you'd give to those students?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite a complicated question. I think that it's definitely worth keeping an open mind, and reading things from various different disciplines, because you do realize that they are actually quite different. What I would really recommend is actually having a look at the course descriptions on the university website. I'm not necessarily sure if students have access to kind of more in-depth information about course structures and reading lists. But I remember when I was looking, when I was applying, I could find some colleges publishing reading lists for their particular topics. And obviously the reading lists by themselves won't tell you much, but if you kind of pick a few texts from there, you might get a good sense. And I might be preempting a question that you're going to ask me, but I do think that the very short introduction series is a really good resource, because there's one on history, there's one on politics, there's definitely one on various types of philosophy. They are, I think that the name genuinely doesn't do them justice. They are often written by kind of specialists in the topic, and they can be very insightful and sophisticated. I think that it would take me too long to go into the main differences between the three disciplines, particularly because I've only really studied one of them. But those very short introductions would be a really good place to start for someone who wants to really get a good sense of which one to do. What I will say in defense of history is that I think it is very broad, and you can actually apply a lot of other humanities focuses to the subjects that you're doing. And obviously the other thing that's worth mentioning is that at Oxford there is no straight politics course. If you're studying politics, you will either do history and politics or PPE, for philosophy, politics, and economics. So either way, if you want to do politics, you will end up also learning lots of different humanities disciplines as well, and social science disciplines.
But that's at Oxford though. I guess if you might find a better course suited to you that's straight politics and other unis. I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right. Of course. Yeah.
Last maybe a bit impossible question, but so from what I know about history at Oxford is there's a lot of reading, a lot of work where you're doing it by yourself, or maybe with your friends, but you're reading the books by yourself. That makes sense. Like you're amongst your friends in the library.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And majority of it reading. You're writing probably two essays a week, roughly.
Yeah. It depends on the term, but yeah, you could be writing 2 essays a week.
And that's a lot. Like that's quite a lot. How do you convince a tutor in your personal statement that is the kind of life you want, that you want to spend 30 hours a week doing history? Because that's not actually to do with how clever you are. That's about how invested you are and passionate and wanting to do the work for a long amount of time for 3 years? Like, is there,
Yeah.
can you express that in a personal statement?
Yeah, I think you can. And again, it does go back to those paragraphs, that they are really important. And they tell a tutor a lot, because a tutor's read a lot of them, and they know which are good and they know which are bad. And I think, if you have undertaken like a particularly ambitious project, or, read a lot about the subject and really shown that in your personal statement, then that in itself, shows that you've already dedicated quite a lot of time to this subject. I think, the other thing that obviously it demonstrates, especially if you've chosen a project yourself, is it shows a lot of initiative, which is precisely what you need, and self-motivation, which is precisely what you need when you're actually studying the degree. So I think that, just doing that is really powerful, and, it can actually, go quite a long way towards persuading a tutor that you're suitable. Obviously, having said that, the personal statement, particularly an Oxford application, isn't the only part of the application process. And there will also be the interviews and the entrance test that kind of demonstrate the other aspects. And so, yeah, I mean, the system of applications that Oxford and Cambridge use is very helpful, and it does give them quite an in-depth understanding of your own strengths. And so, yeah, it's worth bearing that in mind as well. It's part of a wider package.
Yeah. So going back to what you were saying about the personal statement, the 3 paragraphs, I guess you're saying the like writing a lot about one topic, showing that, but not relevant, like writing lots of relevant stuff about one topic in that paragraph, showing that you read about it extensively and in depth, because that is more valuable than writing about lots of things but not covering them in depth, because I guess that's what you'll be doing in your degree if you study history.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. No one will study the whole of history. There's only a certain kind of level to which breadth helps, and after that you do need depth. And I think, yeah, it's worth mentioning that kind of, when I'm talking about stuff that you've done, a module that you've done, at school, I think I did 2 modules and then kind of 1 coursework module. So obviously, you're not going to be talking about the entire module. You might pick a particular, topic you studied within that module that you really enjoyed and it was really interesting, and that you think was interesting enough and that you enjoyed enough to include it as one of your kind of 3 main, paragraphs in a personal statement.
Going on off another tangent, you said that you can't study the whole of history. But having said that, I guess like in the 1600s, you're like limited to the books that you could read, and now Google is like 1 click away, and then like who knows, like 100 years time, if we're like one with AI, and then I guess like, and then maybe in the future you can actually have like instant access to all of history. I know that.
Yeah, and my statements will have aged really badly. I'm sorry about that. Go on.
I mean, I was literally just watching Elon Musk's Neuralink talk. So I was just thinking about this. So I've done you a bit.
Okay, yeah. No, that's fine. And I do have a serious response to your question, which is that, like, with like Google and with so much information on the internet, I spend most of my time working out which information is actually useful, and which information is actually verified, and actually worth reading. Which I think in terms of how long it takes for you to establish that, I mean, it doesn't quite compare to what came before, but that takes a long time as well. And I haven't yet, in our kind of, on the precipice of digital revolution, I still haven't worked out how to learn the whole of history.
I guess to say simply, like, because you study history, you'll probably spot out propaganda quicker than I would, and that's quite useful, no matter how much technology advances.
I
quite a
mean,
bold
well,
statement, but is I know you. Yeah, I stand by it though.
well, no, I mean, scientific propaganda, not necessarily. You know, people using pseudoscientific,
Okay.
terminology
Yeah.
that seems kind of, vaguely reminiscent of
Hmm.
what you'd see in a chemistry textbook. If it's plausibly presented, I might on the surface struggle with that more than you would. So,
Well,
don't
anyway,
sell yourself short.
yeah. All right. All right. Well, anyways, it was lovely having you, Anthony. I
Yeah, a
know
pleasure.
I've learned a lot, and yeah, that's what we've had time today. And yeah, thank you for listening to all of our viewers. And remember, follow us on Instagram, Oxford from the Inside. Check out our Facebook page, and I hope you all stay safe, well, and until next time. Cheers, Anthony.
All right, see ya. Bye.